Complete your conversations. Make sure your telephones are turned off. And it may surprise some of you, but I am not Richard M. Dolan. I am Peter Robbins, and last weekend at this time I was standing on a stage in Orlando, Florida, finishing my duties as MC for the International MUFON UFO Congress. So I am taking this liberty to have the pleasure and pride of presenting your next speaker. In 2000, I had been involved in the field of UFOs for 25 years. And a then just published book, a privately published book, under a publication, a production company called Keyhole Publications, came out. It was absolutely radical to me. It was called UFOs and the National Security State, Volume 1, written by a man I had never heard of named Richard M. Dolan, who happened to live not that far from me in Rochester, New York. I live just outside of Ithaca, New York, in the center of the beautiful state of New York. Well, I read it from cover to cover in several sittings, and I was dumbstruck. It was brilliant, it was grounded, it was incredibly well informed, it was fully annotated, and going to be the first of 3 volumes. In 2002, I was invited to speak at that year's International MUFON Symposium, which is held in a different city every year. And I thought, oh boy, let it be Denver or New Orleans or San Francisco. Oh, not Rochester, New York. Oh boy. Up I headed, hour-and-a-half drive from where I am, and one of the speakers was going to be Richard M. Dolan. I was not aware that he was already quite a few years into the work. And I sat in that audience. To my right was an old friend and close colleague, Dr. David M. Jacobs, an historian teaching on UFOs at Temple University in Philadelphia. David, a very dry, taciturn wit, and the de facto UFO historian at the time, he was cautious about hearing this next speaker, purporting to be an historian type. And we listened. I was knocked out by the presentation. Richard and I made friends later that day, and it's a wonderful friendship that has deepened and endured over the past 15 years plus. And when it was over, I turned to David. I said, what do you think? And with an absolutely straight face, he nodded once. He's a keeper. Well, Richard M. Dolan is an ultimate keeper. Right now, in the field of UFO studies, not just in this country, but internationally, there is no speaker more widely sought after, and with good reason. We don't have a better spokesperson, a more articulate person, a better debater, and really a nicer guy in the field. Richard, if anything, overextends himself to be where he can whenever he can. When he was in university, he was a Rhodes Scholar finalist. He is an historian, and it is my extreme pleasure to present to you, for me, the greatest speaker right now that we have in the field, Richard M. Dolan.
Peter, thank you so much. We really are, we're very close friends. I seem to travel with Peter everywhere I go. We were in Greece this summer, it was amazing. I've been to Brazil with Peter Robbins. I've been to Heber, Arizona when Travis Walton had his first event, which was actually really cool. Peter and I shared another place. I feel like this is, we're like the odd couple. I really feel like Peter and I, but we really get along great, and I love hanging out with him. So yes, I honestly feel like the luckiest person that I know. I get to talk about this subject. I'm going to move this out of the way here. For me, the UFO subject has been this all-encompassing kind of the hole that has pulled me into, and it will never ever let me out. I've said many times, I got into this very tepidly about a little over 20 years ago, to almost 25 years ago, thinking, I just want to find out for myself, is there something to this phenomenon? All these claims that have always been out there, claims of cover-up and so forth. Even in the early 90s, this was very widespread. And it is true, I was very deeply immersed in US Cold War history at that time. I was studying the administration of Harry Truman, circa 1950. It's the same time period as when you start hearing about claims of a cover-up of UFOs. Of course, in the academic world, they don't talk about UFO cover-up at all. It doesn't happen. And so there was this obvious discrepancy, and all I wanted to do back then was just answer a question: is this part of our history or not? Not even were UFOs real. I was very conservative, and I thought 2 months will settle it for me, and I'll move on, and that was over 20 years ago. So what I very quickly found was that this is absolutely real, this is absolutely a part of our history, and it's serious. And when you find out why, well, the reason why is that there were very clearly documented cases. Thank you, Freedom of Information Act. We're very lucky as a society that we had this act in the late 70s, particularly when it was going as full guns as it ever has gone. It got severely undercut in the early 80s under the Reagan years, but we received a lot of documents in the late 70s through FOIA dealing with military encounters with UFOs. I'll talk about some of them here. And so what it did is it proved to me, it didn't hint at it or suggest, but it proved, not that UFOs are necessarily extraterrestrial, although I think that's the most valid hypothesis, but rather that it proved this is a real phenomenon that's important, that involved violations of sensitive airspace by objects that were just not supposed to exist, doing things that were not supposed to be possible. How do we know this? We'll just read the declassified documents. They're there. And you know, the thing to point out is that those documents we have are not even the highest level of classification. Those have continually been off limits to researchers forever. But what we have are mid-level classified documents, and they are pretty darn interesting to read. I've written about them. You can find them online. It's not that tough to find them. So with that, let me get started. This is a subject I call the 6 reasons why UFOs matter. And I would start off by just pointing out that this field is filled with I say a discrepancy. There are actually many discrepancies, but the biggest discrepancy right off the bat when you think of UFOs is as follows. There are, each year I try to do tallies of how many UFO reports there are. It's very difficult. You go worldwide, most nations do not have really an accurate way to tally UFO reports. In the US we do, in Canada we do, and that's because we have a couple of websites that collect them. The MUFON website collects UFO reports in US and Canada primarily. And then there's the National UFO Reporting Center, run by Peter Davenport, that also collects many, many sightings. And if you combine them, for most years, they will have a combined total of about 15,000 reports every year. 15,000 is up to. Last year, I think 2 years ago, Davenport collected about 8,000. In 2015, it was down to like 7,000. It's a lot. MUFON collects about the same amount. It's an unbelievable, and then Canada itself collects another 2,000 or so specifically Canadian sightings every year that are usually reported to a researcher named Chris Rutkowski. So if you add it up, it's probably about 15,000 sightings just on that basis alone every single year, and that's just 2 countries. Now, that doesn't mean every single one of those sightings is a bona fide alien craft or even a black budget triangle made, you know, out of skunk works, but it does mean, or Boeing, but it does mean that there's a lot that's being seen. And this is a question Stan Friedman often asks the audience. I've gotten in the habit of asking. So if you have seen or believe you've seen a UFO, would you mind raising your hand? Okay, keep your hands up. Now, that's a lot of people. That's why you're all here. Now, how many of you have reported it to some official site? So less than 1 out of 10. Thank you very much. Less than 1/10. And this is typical. It's typical. I mean, most people, they see a UFO, they don't know where to report it. But you can, in our society, it's easier than any other country. You go on the web, you log it in. And even here, it's less than 1 out of 10. So now imagine the rest of the world. Brazil, they've got researchers there, but they don't have really a good website that collects all the data. Europe, ditto. Asia, Africa, not a chance. And there's a lot that's going on. So this is a global phenomenon. We do know this. There's just no real reporting system. So there's all of this activity indicating something, and yet no official recognition. That's the discrepancy. It's like you turn on your TV or your official news media, you go onto your mainstream news feed on your website, wherever you go, and in general, this does not enter into our reality, and yet it is everywhere. It's everywhere. Again, it doesn't mean that every single UFO sighting is an alien craft, but this phenomenon is everywhere, and it is very difficult to explain conventionally. This is a real thing that happened. I'm going to walk you through this scenario. So you've had dinner with some friends over your house. It's spring, and it's late in the day, it's still light out, it's getting a little toward dusk, and you're out on your front lawn having some white wine, and you're just chatting. And suddenly, you see this huge, enormous, multiple football field size, roundish craft approaching your position from the horizon. Think about how unbelievable, extraordinary that is. Very slow, and it just then stops over you, and you see it rotating counterclockwise. You see lights, and you are thinking this is probably about 1,000 feet wide. That's 3 football fields. And as it stops over you silently, you're thinking, I wonder if it's looking at us. And suddenly at that moment, this object splits into 4 distinct wedge-shaped craft that instantaneously zoom off north, south, east, west to the 4 cardinal points without making a sound, and you are in a state of absolute shock. And so are your friends. You're in such a state of shock that you don't talk about it, and none of your friends talk about it for more than 2 decades, until one of you makes a report to the National UFO Reporting Center on the web, where it becomes logged into the database. This event did occur in the town of Hydes, Maryland in 1976. Now, I wasn't there. I can't exactly prove, but I'll tell you this. You read the report. This is one of the more interesting, but it's not even the most interesting, and it was very detailed, and I think that I believe this report. If you go through the database of the National UFO Reporting Center, you will see countless such reports like this. There's a lot of them. So this is, an event that is absolutely shocking, absolutely inexplicable, and utterly, I would say, commonplace. That's the discrepancy. It's going on. We can ask some questions about this object, whatever this thing was. First of all, what was it? What was that thing? How is it possible? What technology would allow an enormous craft to move over you, hover silently, and then split into 4 distinct craft that just shoot off instantaneously without making a sound? Think of all of the different technologies that would be involved in that simple act. Not so simple, really. Who's in charge of this thing? What intelligence is controlling it? Is this a real black budget thing? Is this some secret government project? For real? Really? If it's not human, then which not human is making it? Is it extraterrestrial? Is this from some other dimension of reality? All of these are valid questions to ask. We don't really have answers to it. You could ask, does our government know about this? I would think that our government, or elements within our government, we can use that term loosely, would know about it. I would think. Hydes, Maryland is not far. That's the power center of our country, basically. It's the DC area. Another logical question, and I'm sure many of you can identify with this, what would cause someone to be so traumatized by a sighting like that they don't talk about it for decades? Because this happens, this is almost commonplace. You have something that's inexplicable, it happens to you, and you don't know how to process it because it's not supposed to happen. You don't know how to talk about it to other people. So what do? You do what everyone else does. You put it in a little part of your brain, and there it remains, and you just kind of hope it goes away, or you don't really access it. I think every one of us have things in our lives that we've experienced. Doesn't have to be UFO related or paranormal, but we've experienced things in our lives that we're a little bit traumatized by, and we just put them away and we don't think about them for years. And this type of sighting is, I think, often in that category. There's a lot of other questions we can ask about that one simple event. And that's what makes this subject so fascinating. So I'm going to talk about 6 areas that I think the UFO subject matters to every one of us. Because a true assessment of this subject causes us to reevaluate our entire lives, our entire society, our civilization, what we are even as a species. And I would start with our history. That is a fair assessment of the UFO phenomenon, causes us to reevaluate our whole history. Think, oh, right, this is a fascinating account. Do I have the red light on this thing? Yeah, that guy right there. Was I would say he was a genius. He was a brilliant philosopher and artist by the name of Nicholas Roerich. And he was actually a really famous, renowned painter in his day, and he was a truly ahead of the curve philosopher. So in 1927, he was leading a trek, a party, including his wife, into the Himalayas for well, to trek through the Himalayas. I mean, there's a cool thing to do. And it's August 5th, 1927, and they're up there. And as he wrote about this in a book after, the book is called Altai Himalaya, he described something that happened, that they saw in the Himalayas. Now this is a very remote area, obviously. It's 1927. You're not going to see aircraft in the region. And I'll just read what he wrote here in his diary. Someone in the party was seeing a large black eagle or bird in the sky, and above that bird they saw a bright object. He says, we all saw in the direction north to south something big and shiny reflecting sun, like a huge oval moving at great speed. Crossing our camp, this thing changed in its direction from south to southwest, so it maneuvered, and we saw how it disappeared in the intense blue sky. We even had time to take out our field glasses and saw quite distinctly the oval form with the shiny surface, one side of which was brilliant from the sun. It's a very, very detailed description. He wrote about it. This is before the age of flying saucers and so on. What could that thing have been? In all fairness, there are websites that try to analyze this, or at least a few people have tried to. There really isn't a good explanation for this, except one researcher, and I'm not kidding you here, offered the explanation of weather balloon to describe this. Now, in fairness, it is true that there, roughly at that same time, there was a Swedish exploration party. And I say roughly, it's not known if they were around at the same date. They were never closer than 400 miles to Rorich's position. 400 miles for a weather balloon is not a distance weather balloons do not go 400 miles. They don't have that range, and they certainly did not in 1927. The particular weather balloon that the Swedes did launch, and they did launch one, there were weather balloons in 1927, was very small. And it has been, I think, conclusively demonstrated that even if a weather balloon were to have reached their position, it would have had to be so low, it would have had to be like directly right there, or they would never have seen it. And the odds of that are 0 to like 0.0001. It's essentially virtually impossible, we'll say that. There are no cases of weather balloons traveling even 400 miles, even less than that. They don't do it. And they would have had to have been a huge, huge object to have been visible. And plus, this was an oval. It doesn't fit the description. Anyway, so that's Rorich's sighting. I think it was not a weather balloon, and there's really no other logical explanation for it. Oh yes, here's an interesting thing about this sighting. Rorich and his wife, for what it's worth, were both early important theosophists. That is, they were followers of Rudolf Steiner, the philosopher, and also Helena Blavatsky. And in fact, Rorich's wife was an early translator of Blavatsky's work into German, I believe. Does it mean anything? Well, every now and then I think there's this significance of a mental connection that we have with these objects. I think that it is absolutely worth looking into. I myself had 2 sightings in my life. Nothing to write home about that was as interesting as experiences that many of you have had. But in both cases, I always had the feeling that there was a mental connection with me and what I saw. Maybe I can get into that later. But in the case of Rorich and his wife, you could wonder, is there a connection between these sightings and what we would call consciousness? Just a thought to consider. A sighting that I discovered in the Canadian National Archives. I'm not Canadian, but I live near Canada, and I like Canada. I go there. About a decade ago, I spent about half a week in Ottawa in the Canadian Archives. Back in the 70s and 80s, if you were a citizen there, you could write your report of a UFO to give it to the police, who would then forward it to a central office. The scientists there never studied these reports ever, but they would put them in a file cabinet, and that's all they'd ever did. But you could go there and you can read them now. And I did this. So there's this one written by an elderly gentleman in the early 80s, 1980s, and he described a sighting that occurred to him when he was 25 years old in 1936. This is where he was. He was at a place called Aylmer Lake in the Northwest Territories. You cannot live in Aylmer Lake. Nobody lives there. he had a job at age 25, the cool job. In the 1930s, it was finally possible for the Canadian government to send aircraft over the remote regions with cameras to photograph it, so that it would have accurate information from maps and topography and geography and so forth. And that was this guy's job. He had one of those aircraft that could land on the water, a pontoon airplane. And because there's millions or many, many thousands of lakes, infinite amounts of bodies of water up in this region. It's unbelievable. So that was his job. And in 1936, he was doing a pre-flight check on his aircraft. For hundreds of miles around him, there was nothing, no people. And to this day, there are no roads leading there. It is an impossibility to do roads up there. He writes, at the time of the sighting, I was standing on the float of my aircraft performing a pre-flight inspection when I happened to glance skyward and detected the vehicle in question. Notice how this man writes too. He's very, very sophisticated. He says, how long it had been there, and for whatever reason, I have no idea. At the time, the sky was azure blue, completely clear of all cumulus and cirrus clouds, making it virtually impossible to determine the height of the object in question. In trying to describe this vehicle, I can only say that it was the most magnificent configuration of an airship one could imagine. I would say it was very large, but this would depend on the height, which, as stated, could not be determined. Again, you have to love how he's very precise in his description. Then he says, from a north-south, he describes it. So the object was a light aluminum color, he said, did not reflect any sunlight, according to him. It was an elliptical shape. It was slightly elongated, in other words. No portholes. It was stationary for a moment. It was just there. It was in a north-south configuration. And then he said it rotated to east-west. It's like it turned, almost like on an axis, you would think, and then instantly accelerated silently, instantly at the horizon. Within seconds, it was gone, not making a sound. That was the sighting. No contrail. He attached his service record to the with his sighting, which I did not have access to, so I don't know this man's name. It was not included, but presumably it was known to whoever received it. And there you go, 1936, middle of nowhere. Again, none of us were there. We can't really prove it, but this is the thing about the UFO phenomenon. There are case after case, report after report of these types of sightings. I've never been able to figure out how such a person would just make a story up like that. His whole thing was, he said, I don't expect anyone to investigate what I saw. I'm just putting it in for posterity, and I'm glad that I found it. You could find it too. You have to go to Ottawa, make an appointment, and you go in there. In my book, UFOs for the 21st Century Mind, I wrote about this and indicated the record number, so you actually could just go and find it. What's up in 1936 in the Northwest Territories at Aylmer Lake? And why was that object directly over him? You got to wonder again. It was clearly observing him, I think we can say, and then it just takes off. I would say whatever it is, this type of someone's phone is going. Thank you. Yeah, silent mode would be really ideal. There are these types of sightings that they exist. There's not a lot of them that go back into the early years, but there are some. And of course, there are many that go back even further that make us wonder what's happening. There are, if you want to get into the military aspect of it, this is really what I've always preferred to focus on. I have on my website, which is richarddolanpress.com, I have a lot of articles I've written over the years, and this one I think is a very useful one. I call it 12 Government Documents That Take UFOs Seriously. I wrote this some time ago. What I have is there's JPEG images of these various documents. I can talk about a couple of them, and then my own description about them, indicating why they are so significant. And what I would say is, some of these are to UFO researchers, I would say they're kind of classic. 1947 Twining memo. That's from 3-star General Nathan Twining. He later became a 4-star general and Chief of Staff of the U.S. Air Force. In 1947, he wrote a memo to another general describing this flying saucer phenomenon, stating that the phenomenon is real, not visionary or fictitious. That's September 1947. It's a rather significant statement in a classified memo, I should think. Consider what the US government was telling the public at that time. They were explicitly telling the public that it was imaginary and fictitious. And here's, in a classified conversation, a very powerful man saying, no, it's real, it's not visionary. And then actually went on to describe in great detail the characteristics of these so-called flying saucers as reported by military personnel. And the description is quite explicit, including silent, usually, well-kept, well-made maneuvers. Oh, and my favorite, domed on top, flat on bottom. It's 1947. What is domed on top and flat on the bottom? You know, there's nothing officially on the record that should be doing that. There are rumors of acquired German/Nazi technology from the war. It's not the worst argument in the world to say that there is a connection there. There were Germans during the war who were working on some very exotic technology. But even today, it has to be said, we don't really have a good smoking gun that can really nail that. And all of the other follow-up questions that would deal with the infrastructure that would be building these flying saucers, or explain the fact that they've been seen worldwide, or explaining the fact that you've got these earlier sightings like the Canadian one I just described, or the Nicholas Roerich one, and many others. So there's something more going on here. Anyway, this is it's a useful article. I would encourage you, if you're interested in a factual-based treatment of why this matters to the government, I would encourage you to read that article. There is a definite nuclear connection that these objects have had with us. At Los Alamos in the late 1940s, we have a phenomenon known as the green fireball phenomenon. Los Alamos, if you're not familiar with your history, was where the United States detonated the first atomic bomb. Los Alamos National Labs is one of the key technology centers of the United States, and back then always been heavily associated with nuclear technology. These so-called green fireballs were not natural fireballs. They got the attention of the military establishment and scientific establishment. They were flying low, frequently over Los Alamos, maneuvering, sometimes landing or falling in different patterns. And we do not know to this day what the official conclusion was. We do know that this was a subject of great concern to the military establishment. Oak Ridge in Tennessee, similar, important nuclear technology site. And in the 40s and 50s, we know for sure, through declassified documents, that there were countless repeated violations of Oak Ridge airspace by unknown objects doing extraordinary things. FBI monitored, Army intelligence, military intelligence. Hanford site in the state of Washington, another nuclear site where there were incredible, there's one memo we have from 1950 describing objects round in shape, many of them being seen over the Hanford site. Air Force jets attempted interception with negative results. Anti-aircraft battalions have been alerted. Things like this. Wow. Could you imagine if such a memo had gotten out to the public in 1950 as it was happening? I think the reaction would have been quite significant, but it wasn't. It was classified, and by the time it was released decades later, well, propaganda, spin, media control take control, and people just don't really become aware. And I think to this day, they're really not aware. In the Congo, there's a very interesting event over a uranium mine there that was documented by US military. A lot of these other Pacific nuclear detonations I wrote about in my last book, 21st Century Mind, witness that I interviewed at length to describe UFOs. Nukes were detonated, over 2,000 nukes were detonated on this planet from 1945 to 1998, 2050. Yeah. We don't really talk about the environmental impact of that. All right, so we have Hiroshima and Nagasaki where they were used in wartime, and then more than 2,000 way higher yield and dangerous nukes were being detonated in the upper atmosphere and below ground too, but a lot of upper atmosphere. There was countless stories of these of UFOs, bogies being seen during these nuclear detonations. Over our missile bases, rocket launches, and over Soviet facilities during the Cold War as well. They've got some very, very dramatic cases which are available to read. So all of this, and this is only scratching the surface, to be honest with you, relating to the history, causes us to reevaluate our history. So one person might ask you, well, why do UFOs matter? Well, if you care about history, one thing it would do is it would say we need to reevaluate the history of our society. There are gaping holes in our official narrative that is being handed to us by academic historians and by political people who want to spin our history to us. And there's this enormous missing component to our history, particularly our modern history, where this phenomenon is obviously making its presence felt, and you have a power structure that is clearly not interested in explaining it to the rest of us. What I didn't get into here with you, but I do believe that if you get into subjects such as the ancient astronaut or ancient alien hypothesis, that there's a good case. I do think the television show Ancient Aliens takes a lot of liberties with the evidence, but there's also a very good case, I think, to be made that we have a big, big hole in our ancient history. And if you look at all of that evidence, which again, I guess on your own you can look into it, I think there's evidence for a long-term presence, long-term observation, long-term interaction that we have had with, let's just say, others, I often call them, or we could say interaction or management. After all, it's only been in the last century or so that we've had any kind of technology that we can call somewhat sophisticated. If there was a presence of other beings here centuries ago, really, what could we possibly be able to do about it? Would it be possible for them to manage us in one way or another? I would think the answer is probably yes. Are we someone's project? It's a fair question to ask. You know, the early writer on this subject, Charles Fort, from which we get the term Fortean. Fort spent years in the New York Public Library in the 19-teens and 20s and going through weird reports, newspaper reports of things that just did not make any sense. Some of them include what we would call UFO reports. And in one of his books, he just made a very, very blunt statement. We are property. We are property. Are we? Well, it's a question to ask. And here's a question to ask in terms of our history. I don't have an answer to this. If others are here, to what extent is the human race an independent actor? Just fair to ask. We like to think of ourselves at the top of our little earthly food chain here. We do what we want. But if that's really the case, that there are others who have been here a long time, it's fair to ask, even just speculating, are we really running things, or are we being used in one way or another? I was just talking with someone today or yesterday about dogs. Oh, yes, I remember this. This had nothing to do with this conference, but I had a conversation with an individual whose sister is an expert dog trainer. And I was just having, and you know, there are people who do this, and I have a dog, but dog trainers, you know, they'll have dogs that are very highly trainable to do certain things, and they use the dog's predator instinct to get them to do what they want them to do. And it got me thinking, so those dogs are being used, their nature is being used to train them to do things, whether they're being rescue dogs or other things that, you know, we consider valuable to us, to our civilization. The dog is having his or her nature being modified or used to do something else. As far as the dog's concerned, they're just doing what they do, but they don't realize that they're being really essentially manipulated, not necessarily in a negative way, but they're being manipulated, and their own nature is being used in that way by us. So here's a question to ask. Is our nature being used in some way that we're not aware of by a different intelligence? It's just a thought. I don't know the answer to that, but it's a thought. Here's another question to ask, and if you look at the history of military interactions, and indeed we could say confrontations with these UFOs, we need to wonder, are there hostilities, covert hostilities, a secret war even, between some of the world's militaries and these other beings? And it's worth asking, because there are cases where, our jets and other nations' jets do chase after these objects. There are cases, some rumors, but there are some that appear to be deaths of pilots and of military personnel in connection with the UFO phenomenon. I don't know if that's indicative of a full-out war, but we need to ask these types of questions. One thing for certain I would say, there is an enormous hidden reality that is part of our history, and as I said earlier, in total contradiction to our officially sanctioned narrative. There's something big going on here. It's absent from our history. It's absent from our current political discourse. Certainly absent from our presidential candidates' speeches. It's absent from anything that really matters in terms of our power structure. I would say this, with a secret that profound, and I think I will get into this later, but I'll just say, so rewind the clock back to the 1940s and put yourself in the position of a president like Harry Truman, and just assume that he was presented with information about this subject that indicated, yes, it is real. And maybe even furthermore, that a crash at a place like Roswell, New Mexico, of a non-human technology was real. And that furthermore, maybe we recovered bodies, that was real. So if you're in charge of the US power structure, what would you do with that information? I don't think you would necessarily tell the world about it. That's a very big thing to do. You yourself don't know, are these other beings friend or foe? You don't know. If we tell the world we've got some exotic technology, does that mean we have to share that exotic technology? It becomes very difficult not to if you admit that you've got it. It's a lot easier to keep it to yourself if you just act like it doesn't exist and you deny all. And then you don't know about the public reaction. Would there be panic? Well, maybe, there might be some. And then all of the inevitable questions that would arise that you'd have to answer, you would be expected to know, and you may not know. So I think it would be a much more logical policy at the time to create a team around you, have them study it and say, let's figure this out. Let's exploit the technology. Let's find out who these other beings are for the time being, and we'll manage the press. We'll manage the academic institutions. We'll keep everyone in line. We can do it. We know how to do it. And then we'll reevaluate our position and maybe at some point in the future release this to the public. The problem with that theory is that once that secret gets going, you can kind of see how it would continue and deepen and develop a life of its own. And that is, I think, exactly what has happened. And this phenomenon necessitates what I would say is an ever tighter control over that narrative. Once you get into a lie like this, and once people start making money off of that lie through studying the technology, for example, there's got to be a lot of money there. The incentive for giving this secret up, I think, goes down to less than zero. And then it becomes more and more profoundly important to control that narrative. And that, I think, is what we have seen. This is my hypothesis, my thesis. We have seen this over the past 70 years. So that's history. That's just a little bit of history and how the UFO phenomenon causes us to reevaluate our own history. Then there's science. This is a subject that has profound scientific implications. Let's start with something as simple as propulsion technology. And that's the simplest. And that itself is revolutionary. So ask yourself, just like that first UFO case that I presented to you from Maryland from the 70s, what could cause a craft or allow a craft to loiter indefinitely, to instantly accelerate, and make things like right-angle turns at high speeds, which they do, and all the other things that we hear about UFOs doing, shooting straight up, for example, or splitting into multiple parts and so on. This is off the charts capability, and yet we get these reports again and again. Well, in terms of propulsion, one possible answer to that would be through what we call electrogravitics. This is a science. It doesn't get any mainstream attention, although the Air Force now is very quietly, officially, has acknowledged that they are studying electrogravitics. There was an American scientist years ago named T. Townsend Brown, the pioneer of electrogravitics. And essentially, the idea is you use an electric field to charge and polarize positive-negative field of an object. And if it's disc-shaped, it works best. And to have an intensely positive and an intensely negative charge allows that object to move. That is electrogravitics, and it is essentially a form of what we would call field propulsion, or a better word, more common word would be anti-gravity type of a system. It's been studied a great deal. There's been a long series of testimony, I think good leaks that indicate that this has been studied in the classified world for a long time. And again, as I say, officially the Air Force has acknowledged they are studying it. So electrogravitics alone is something that would revolutionize our world if that were actually openly applied. Then think about other sciences connected to UFOs, something like space-time. I mean, after all, we think of, at least we speculate, that these objects, these beings, might come from another part of our universe. Sometimes that's an unpopular theory. Sometimes we prefer things like they're another dimension of reality. But they really could be from another part of our universe. Why not? We ourselves are this close from attaining some of those types of capabilities. How would it be possible? A lot of astronomers like to say, it's impossible to go from the stars to our planet. It's way, way too far. And then they'll say, condescending things like, well, you people don't even realize just how distant the stars are. And it's true, the stars are very, very distant. They're way farther than from, our distance to another planet in our solar system, that's for sure. You and I are not going to be able to get to another star using our current technology that's on the books. That's true. However, over 20 years ago, this fellow, Miguel Alcubierre, over at the University of Wales, he's a mathematician, did the math. This math is good. That essentially developed, like on Star Trek, you have warp drive. He did the math that demonstrates that something like warp drive is actually possible. Really is possible. And the way you do it is you create a disturbance in space-time. And you ask yourself, well, what the heck is space-time? Well, it's a good question to ask. Space and time are not separate entities like we like to think, the way Isaac Newton 300 years ago postulated. Newton was a great genius, but he didn't quite grasp this. He was too early. Space and time, as we now know, are a fabric. That's why we call it the space-time fabric. It doesn't make any sense, but yet it's true. Time is affected by certain things, by the speed through which you travel. Time is affected. Time is affected by gravity, the gravity of an object, and many, many other things. And in the Big Bang wasn't just some big explosion in space. The Big Bang was the creation of space and time. Any physicist would tell you there was no before the Big Bang. And we go, huh? How's that possible? But that's what they'll tell you. It tells me that space and time have a finite nature to them. So somehow they can be manipulated. And what Alcubierre is saying in his math is that a powerful gravitational field can create a disturbance in space-time, shrinking it in front of you, expanding it behind you, creating a kind of bubble in space-time, as it were, through which, so you're not violating the speed of light law within that space-time bubble, but somehow you're like riding a space-time wave, as it were. It's kind of like a warp drive idea. It's a distortion in space-time that would propel you. Again, the math is good. What we don't have is the amount of energy, at least officially, to create that kind of field or force. But if the math is good, maybe we'll figure out the source of energy as well. The theory is there. The idea of dimensions is affected by the UFO phenomenon. What I'm really pointing out here is that the UFO subject has been, scientists love to debunk UFOs by saying, that's impossible, this is impossible, that's impossible. It's impossible for an object to instantly accelerate. The pilot inside would be dead. This is an argument they used back then. Well, propulsion technology, electrogravitics shows maybe that's not impossible. Or they would say it's impossible to go travel through the stars. And indeed, the theories of Alcubierre show it's not impossible. Same as with dimensions. There is a very large group of astronomers and mathematicians who talk about multiple dimensions to our universe. I don't know that they're right, and there are astronomers and mathematicians who do not agree, but this is a fairly significant school of thought now. If you're familiar with the work of Brian Greene or Michio Kaku, these are people who deal with what's known as string theory. And I'm not going to get into the details of string theory. I've tried to study it. I'm not a scientist. But what they do what string theory postulates is that it works with the existence of many different dimensions of reality. The number used to be 11, and I think it's now a higher amount, where the mathematics of string theory do work if you've got multiple dimensions of reality. But what is a dimension of reality? I mean, we know about our 3 dimensions, and then the dimension of time is considered one, but what are 5th and 6th and 7th and 8th dimensions? Don't know, but there's math that supposedly allows for multiple dimensions. Our own brains are set up in a certain way. We're not omniscient. There's limits to what we're able to conceive of. We conceive of reality through space and time, but it conceivably might be possible for other entities to perceive and work in greater dimensions of reality. Yes, I think so. So the bottom line is that our physics today do not have a grand theory of everything. We're missing something very important in our physics. And it's been my belief for quite a while now that the UFO phenomenon, and indeed other things that we might consider paranormal, are somehow connected, possibly, I guess, with these additional dimensions of reality that we're not normally perceiving it. But they exist, and sometimes we perceive them. It would be like, if you're a fish in a pond and a person comes into your pond, you're not really going to know what you're dealing with. They can enter your reality and leave your reality. You're a fish. You don't even know that there's life on land. You don't know that there are stars in the sky. You don't even know that you're swimming through the water because you're a fish. But we know that there's water, and we know that there's land, and we know that there's space. But we have our own limitations, presumably, and there may be dimensions that we are not aware of. Then you get into some really stranger things. This whole, what I speculate, this mental mind connection that many of UFO witnesses have with the objects. That maybe the Rorich Party had, and maybe that the Canadian witness in 1936 had, and maybe that many of you have had, where you've had this feeling that this thing is getting into my head. There's stories, and I've collected several of these. One in particular, very dramatic. A young teenage girl, back in the 70s, she's sleeping, it's middle of the night, she wakes up in the middle of the night and has an urge to look out her bedroom window and sees an orange orb floating in her backyard. This is a true story, and I know this story quite well. What causes that? What causes someone to wake up in the middle of the night and you look out and you see the orb? Well, I think we can assume there's a mental connection there. There's a mind connection. So how is this possible? Skeptical scientists might say, well, that's nonsense. It's not nonsense. There's a science of consciousness and entanglement that just might be able to allow us to understand what's going on here. There is entanglement for atoms. Many of you may be familiar with the idea of entanglement, where atoms at large distances from each other are connected in some way that we can't really quite understand, but they are connected at a faster than light speed connection. That's entanglement. And now, can consciousness be entangled? If you listen to people like Michio Kaku talk about it, he says not really, but I don't know. At least we can be open to the possibility that there may be greater levels of entanglement, that might actually be what we call telepathy. Don't know. There's definitely something to what we would call remote viewing. I think that's a real phenomenon. How do we explain how remote viewing works? There's something about us that allows certain people to see across space and across time. Whatever it is, there's something involved in that. So what I'm saying, and there's another question, we can ask, to what extent do thoughts create reality? That's an all-night conversation right there. The point is that science is catching up to the UFO reality in so many ways. Whether it's propulsion, whether it's space-time, whether it's dimensions, whether it's consciousness. The UFO phenomenon is way ahead, and it's almost as if, we might say, it's taking us by the hand and walking us through these very complex leading-edge ideas. And what I would say to some people who are very deeply skeptical of the UFO phenomenon is that any subject that can allow you to get to the leading edge of so many issues in our science, in our history, and I'll talk about in our politics and our energy and everything else, that's something important. That's very important. And the UFO subject truly is at the leading edge of all of these things. Let me talk about energy, why it matters. Well, I think it's pretty obvious. Anyone with the most reasonable level of intelligence who understands what the UFO phenomenon is realizes that they are able to do things, instant acceleration, right angle turns, without making a sound. They're probably using a source of energy that's a little bit better than petroleum, whatever that source is. There's a lot of theories as to what that source might be. There's people who talk about the zero-point energy. Zero-point energy is a real phenomenon, and essentially all it means is that it has been scientifically measured and determined that at the most tiny segment of reality that exists, you get onto the level of an atom and you go a million times smaller than that, you're at the basic fabric of our existence, that there are particles that come into existence and pop out of existence. They collide with their opposite, matter and antimatter. Boom, and there's an exchange of energy at that infinitesimally small level. It's called the zero-point energy level because it occurs independent of thermal energy, that is, at 0 degrees Kelvin. So in other words, it's not heat related. It's everywhere. Zero-point energy exists in the depths of interstellar space. And it exists inside your body. It exists all around you. And the question is, can zero-point energy be tapped and utilized? It would be the ultimate source of free energy. There's a big argument or debate, uncertainty as to whether it is or not. Some people believe the answer is yes, that there's a tremendous amount to be harnessed. We just have to figure out how. So anyway, it's an interesting theory. Maybe it's zero-point energy is what these objects use. There's some reason to wonder that that's the case. Or something even simpler, but still exotic, clean fusion. Clean nuclear fusion. Not the kind of nuclear energy we currently use, which is very environmentally toxic. That's fission, by which the atoms are split up. They produce a lot of energy, but also a lot of dangerous radiation. Fusion's different, and you're fusing these atoms, which creates an even greater amount of energy than fission, and is clean. It's been this holy grail. It's really possible, it could work. Clean fusion would revolutionize this world. It would be basically limitless energy that would be clean. There's a lot of other possibilities. There's a lot of very brilliant people in this world right now working on alternative energy solutions. I have it from a very, I think, a reliable source who told me just not long ago of this person's knowledge of the major petroleum companies sending their people really around the world. This is like a scouting, like baseball teams will have scouts. The major petroleum companies have their scouts, and they're looking for young people with brilliant ideas on alternative energy, and they buy up the ideas, and they pay off the people, give them a lot of money, and keep the ideas from getting out there. Probably true. There's a lot of ideas out there that would potentially remake our world. One of them is probably what these UFO craft are using, or maybe more than one. The point is, there's an energy paradigm waiting to be revolutionized by the UFO phenomenon once it comes out. So I've always liked to say, implicit in a post-disclosure world is a post-petroleum world as well, a post-petroleum infrastructure that is about as revolutionary as you can think. Our whole globe is based on petroleum. The whole global financial structure is based on petroleum. The entire United States foreign policy, the reason, I have to say this, I'll only say this once, that the reason that the United States is the destroyer of nations, particularly throughout the Middle East, is because of petroleum and maintenance of the petrodollar system geopolitically. All of that changes with the advent of a disclosure of an alternate source of energy. Petroleum then would become irrelevant as our primary source of energy. So here's a question to ask. Because I'm not a utopian. I'm a little bit of an idealist, I'll admit that, but I'm not a utopian. I don't necessarily believe that free energy is going to fix every problem we have in our society. But it's worth asking, how would free energy change our society? It would change it why is this changing on its own automatically? One more time. Don't. Okay. So, I must have set this up to automatically transition. Sorry. How would free energy change our society? It would be liberating. It would be liberating for everyone in this room and beyond, because it would allow you For example, if you had a free energy device to go off the grid, you could say to your utility company, hey, up yours, buddy, and you wouldn't need them. And if you have your own free energy, it's more than just heating your house or giving yourself air conditioning through the summer for free. That's great, but think about what that would do for because economic growth really is very closely dependent on the price of energy. And if energy is expensive, economic growth is generally going to be very low. If energy is super cheap and abundant, people find ways of making things happen and inventing things, and it could really be an amazing thing for our society. It would probably revolutionize us in ways that we cannot even imagine. There's also a danger. You give people a lot of energy, not everyone's a nice person, and it's certainly possible that there would be people who would misuse great amounts of energy for things that might be considered dangerous. It would create an instability to our world. And I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, or I'm not saying we should, but I do suggest that what we would call free energy would really remake our world in dramatic ways. So then, that's energy. And then there's personal reasons that the UFO phenomenon is very important. And what I mean, there's some very strange things about this that people go through. One, independent of the UFO beings, there's this whole, I believe, this whole infrastructure around it dealing with what we call the classified world, the covert world. At this point, I cannot tell you how many individuals I've interviewed, that I've talked to, who've had very bizarre interactions with strange, sorry, is it the wrong thing? With strange people, strange beings. My own feeling is that there is a classified group that is monitoring this phenomenon. It's important for them. I mentioned esoteric connections, and it was during the panel someone asked about is there a connection between a human elite group and these ETs, and does it go back through the centuries? I don't know for sure, but I suspect that there is something to this, that our elites do take esoteric knowledge seriously, and that somehow this is connected with their knowledge of the UFO subject. But more fundamentally, I guess, the UFO subject is a intensely personal experience that if you have one, especially if you have an interaction with a being in some way, this is very personal, and sometimes it's traumatic, and sometimes it's transformative. It can be a deeply upsetting, or it can be a deeply uplifting experience. I'm sure there are people in this room for whom it's been one or the other, maybe both. Whatever it is, it shouldn't be surprising, because this is something that is so extraordinary, it's so beyond our official conception of what reality is. So when you experience something that's beyond that, it forces you, right, to reevaluate your sense of what is real and what reality is. And if your reality has been expanded beyond what you're officially told, how do you then fit yourself into this little puzzle piece that you're supposed to fit? It's very difficult. That's why it is hard for people, or it can spur certain people into saying, the hell with it, I am liberating myself from the confines of this. I'm always led to the very wise words of the late John Mack, who wrote about this in one of his abduction books. John Mack, of course, taught at Harvard for years and studied abductions. And he said, look, the whole process of personal growth really is dependent on us being able to shed the illusions that we were raised with. Illusions about ourselves and illusions about our society around us. And shedding those illusions is painful, because we get attached to them, but it's also necessary if we're going to become what we are really, our higher selves are destined to be. I completely agree with this. And what the experiences that many of you have gone through, and many other UFO experiences have had, are transformative and traumatic, but maybe they have to be traumatic for each of us to go through the process of reevaluating what it is we are, to give us an opportunity to see something beyond the little box, the little reality box that we were born into. I believe that that is the case. Whatever the case is, this is important, and it does not, there are certain public officials, public figures, who like to make fun of abductions. They like to make fun of the topic, and it's a big joke. And some of them are very prominent people. And whether they're Neil deGrasse Tyson, who makes fun of abductees, he's done it many times, or Bill Nye, the science guy, or any of these others, it's beneath them. They should really think twice about this. Because whatever the truth about this phenomenon is, it's important and it's affecting people, and it means something important for our society. We need to understand what's going on there. In terms of the personal aspect, we need to ask, what are these other beings anyway? You know, we can go through witness testimony, but we can also think this through to some extent. What are these other beings in terms of their psychology, their physiology, their sexuality, their emotions and their desires? Let's think about this. I don't know for sure, but I have speculated for some time that not all of these beings are natural biological creations. In fact, I'm not alone in this. After all, we in our society are this close to being able to create basically a transhuman species. There's a TV show, it's on Amazon Prime. I just watched a couple of episodes called Humans. Has anyone seen this? Anyone? No one? Okay, one person in the back. Great couple of people. Excellent. It takes place in the near future, and it's BBC, right? And they're creating synthetic humans. It's very interesting. So this is the world that we are actually moving toward ourselves. I think of these other beings. If we're actually ever going to travel through space, chances are we would need to modify our physiology and even our psychology. If you're creating an artificial being of some sort, they probably don't have the psychological reactions that a human being or an earth mammal might have. You know, a creature that nurses at its mother's breast when it's young and bonds with its mother and its parents and has a need for unconditional love, which is what we do. That's what drives us. Is that what drives these other beings? Maybe not. I don't know. Do they have sex the way that we do? Do they have a bonding with families the way we do? Do they have emotions like we do? I think it was Denise Stoner who was talking earlier about, you know, an alien being during an abduction experience questioning, why are you so upset? You know, can you please calm down? And one hears this frequently in abduction literature. It's almost as if they don't really understand our emotions. They probably can't because they're not like us. So are we able to relate to them? Can they relate to us? I'm guessing to some extent the answer is a no. I mean, I can relate to my dog. My dog can relate to me on a certain level, but we're mammals. We actually have, as beings, we have probably more in common with each other than we might with these beings that are here. It's quite possible. I would say what these others seem to be, this is my best working theory right now, is that they did come here from somewhere else, not from Earth. It's my best guess. They certainly have extraordinary technology, extraordinary science that we would call off the charts, as Arthur C. Clarke would have said, indistinguishable from magic. They can enter and leave our reality. I talked about this a little while ago. They've probably been here a long time, and I think they're interested in Earth and humanity. I say this because if you go through a lot of the reports, there are reports of these craft, these objects in the most remote places, like the Himalayas, like Northwest Territories in Canada, like the Arctic Ocean, like the middle of the Pacific Ocean, you know, where people don't live, but they're seen there. Also, over densely populated areas where people do live and people are. And there's definitely an interest with some people, as evidenced by a lot of testimony. Personally, I think that makes sense. Earth is extremely interesting. We've got the amazing planet of all this life forms, this DNA, all this water, all these minerals. Yeah, they probably would find it fascinating. And I think humanity itself is of great interest. I always laugh a little bit when I hear researchers say, well, why would aliens be interested in us? We're just like little insects that can't get along with each other. I disagree. I think humans are very interesting. I think our minds are very interesting. I think our technology has got to be interesting to them because they've seen we're reinventing ourselves. We've got computers, we've got quantum computing, we've got AI on the way. I think we'd be quite interesting to them. We've got nuclear technology. No, I think they'd be watching us. And I think that is exactly what they are doing. So that's just a little bit personally. Then spirituality. We all have our own spiritual ideas. I've gone through the gamut in my lifetime. I grew up as a Roman Catholic. I went to church, did Mass. I became an atheist. I became a pantheist at some point. I became everything you can imagine. I went through it. I'm at a point where I would say I have an attitude that I would call spiritual in the sense that I personally believe that there is a dimension of reality beyond this body. I believe, I don't know for sure, but I believe that when this body of mine dies, that there will be something with my consciousness that exists in some form. Let's call it our spirit. I don't know this, but I think it's a real possibility. In terms of our ideas about spirituality, my own investigation into this, I think there's a lot of contact going on, clearly, and this is my own assessment. I don't specialize in abductions per se, but I've talked with a lot of experiencers too. And my sense is that a disproportionate number of them have what I would call psychic ability in one way or another. I personally believe that everyone has some psychic ability because I think that that's just our nature, but I do think some people are maybe a little more advanced. Like everyone's got musical ability, but some are really good and others are relatively tone deaf, and it might be the same with psychic ability. And I've seen, haven't done statistics on it, that there's a high percentage of people with psychic ability who have had some kind of contact and experience. I would say it's an extremely high percentage, to be honest with you. Yes, also people who meditate. High percentage. I hear this is all anecdotal. Someone will say to me, I've been meditating for a while. Once I started meditating, I had a very bizarre experience, telepathically, psychically with other entities, or sometimes physically. Hard to quantify, but I notice. I speculate that, the quality of our mind matters to them. If you're a super telepathic alien being observing the mass of humanity, most of people, here we go. Watching humanity, most of them watching, they're Dancing with the Stars or the latest hockey game, you'd be like, maybe you wouldn't be interested in them. You probably wouldn't be that interested in them. But if you see someone who's meditating or they've got genuine psychic abilities of some sort, you might say, oh, that person over there, let's take a look. I think that's a reasonable thing to think about. There have been some very strange things that I have noticed in some of my research into this. That is what we might call occult or esoteric connections. People having connections, waking up after a bizarre experience at 3:33 a.m. Does this resonate with anybody? A couple of people saying yes. Hands a little bit going up. There's something going on there. I haven't figured this out exactly. There have been a couple of cases I have looked into. Some have seen the light of day, others not, that are truly bizarre, truly bizarre. I just published a book by an excellent author, Mike Cleland. It's called The Messengers, and he's in the UFO field. He's known as the Owl Guy. Why? Well, his book deals with owls. Why would you think owls? Well, the subtitle is called Owls, Synchronicities, and the UFO Abductee. And all I'll say is that when you come out of that book, I read every word of it, I edited the book, you come out of that book, I am left with an undeniable sense that there are bizarre synchronicities in our world connected with this phenomenon. Synchronicities often that are only available to the witness to figure out. It's almost as if these experiences are designed for you in some way for you to figure out. I encourage you to read The Messengers. It's one of the best, most innovative UFO books in the last decade or more. And Mike is, I think, a worthy successor to people like John Keel and Jacques Vallée in looking into the truly strange nature of this phenomenon. And maybe I'm going to say it, maybe even better. So, oh yes, I think that this is true. So let's say a shadowy human group monitoring this whole process, including the birth of what we might call special children. I see that I'm starting to run out of time. I got a little bit of time. I don't want to blow past, but I would say that there are a number of individuals I've interviewed who have gone to what Whitley Strieber once called the secret school. All right, so in other words, for people who are very gifted, identified, there does seem, I would say, to be a manner in which these people are tagged and monitored, and who's doing that group? Who's doing the tagging and monitoring? I don't know. So the real question, oh yeah, so here's something, again, when we talk about these strange questions about consciousness and telepathic connections, it's hard to measure this stuff, and it can be frustrating because there's a lot of folks out there who will also make claims that might seem a little off the wall, and you can't confirm them anyway. And then there is others that are a little more, maybe a little more credible in your mind. To me, the question is not, is it possible to have a mind-to-mind link with these other beings? I think that's absolutely possible. But I'd like to ask myself, again, scientifically or in any other way of evidence, how does it work? How is it that we're connecting to them telepathically? You know, people who have abduction experiences, the communication is almost always telepathic. It's not verbally usually. Can we demonstrate it? Can we replicate it? Then there's philosophy. The UFO phenomenon is actually very interesting in terms of philosophy. What do I mean? In the last generation in particular, there's almost been this philosophical divide, I would say, in this field. The old line of ufology, pre-internet. I have a full collection of the MUFON Journal and a lot of the other UFO journals. I've read them. And what you find is that the old philosophy of investigation in the 60s and 70s and 80s was very nuts and bolts. The MUFON the method, if you see a UFO, they'll ask you, so if you hold your arms at arm's length, how big was it? Was it the size of a quarter? I mean, this is important and we need to do it, but it's a very mechanical way of understanding this phenomenon. Since the 90s in particular, we've had the New Age movement just go right into the UFO field. And what I see, anyway, is a divide between, I would call subjectivism versus objectivism, spiritualism versus materialism, religion, I have in quotes, versus science. In other words, people who will have experiences that cannot be confirmed one way or the other. They'll say, well, I had a download, I had a telepathic connection. And it's increasingly hard to be able to analyze. Or people who like to make predictions based on what they know as their sources that they're getting. A heart-centered versus a mind-centered way of looking at things. I think that this is, I generally am very much on the objectivity side of the line, but I will say that I recognize that there's a subjective element to this phenomenon that is difficult for our science to catch up to. If you have this kind of a deep transformative experience of a vision that you get, whatever, I can't disprove it. I can't say it's not important, and my hope is that ufology in the 21st century, through the science of consciousness, we can figure out ways of coming to terms with this. So I say here, understanding the science of the mind and non-locality is essential. Non-locality is simply a fancy term in science and physics to say that your consciousness is non-local to your body. So it can be outside your body. That's really what we're talking about. And is it possible? By the way, there are neurologists and scientists of consciousness right now. This is a big argument. They call them the brain wars. So the dominant science school in that is very materialistic, very hardcore, like atheist materialists, and saying you don't have free will. Consciousness is simply a construct of your chemicals and electrical connections. But there are neurologists and scientists, I've spoken with them, they're brilliant, who say quietly, because they get shouted down, no, consciousness is beyond the brain. And I think understanding this would lead us to a better understanding of the UFO phenomenon, frankly. I'm getting toward the end here. What I would say is that this phenomenon, these beings, have an effect on us as a society. They change us. They change you through your experiences with them. They change us as a society. I say they change us from the profane to the esoteric. And all I mean is by, I'm not actually sure what I meant when I wrote that. When you have, right? I think that was a 2 a.m. thing after like too many glasses of wine. But I guess I would say what I mean is when you have an experience that rocks your world and transforms your reality, it causes you to go into deeper beliefs and deeper questioning about what your world is. I do think that this phenomenon has generated new ideas. It's affecting us in ways that we're not really fully recognizing. One book I would love to write, if I ever get a chance, is a dedicated book on the transformation of our society because of the UFO phenomenon. If you want to write it, do it. It's an important subject. This phenomenon is a real phenomenon that has affected us in our pop culture through television shows in the 1950s and movies, and Star Trek, I think, has been affected by the UFO phenomenon. I don't think we would have the whole sci-fi space, sci-fi fiction the way we do if there had been no genuine UFO phenomenon. It's affected our science at a covert, clandestine level, I believe, through black budget technology. It's affected our society deeply. It's transformed and corroded our political system through the secrecy. I'm going to get to that now, in fact. So let me move on to the politics, because I'm getting a little late here. I wrote 2 books with the phrase national security state in it. I would like to say I coined the phrase, but I didn't. Actually, as far as I could tell, the late great writer Gore Vidal coined the phrase. I like using it. It's made a little currency since I wrote my books, though. What I call the national security state, that is the great surveillance homeland security state that has basically transformed our country, really exploded after World War II, and then it really exploded and became kind of an open thing after 9/11, kind of like the coming out party like a debutante has. After 9/11, the national security state kind of came out. Here I am, and now you're living in my reality. Let me just, the U.S. now has 17, I think it's up to 17 intelligence agencies. It's not just the CIA, and it's not just the Defense Intelligence Agency, it's not just Air Force Intelligence or the Office of Special Investigations. It's 17 major intelligence agencies, and those are the ones that we know about. Keep in mind that groups like the NSA existed in secrecy for a long time before they were outed, or the NRO, the National Reconnaissance Office, existed for 30 years in secrecy. So we probably have other secret intelligence agencies. A world of homeland security, an era of warfare abroad, surveillance and control at home. Why am I talking about this here? Because the UFO phenomenon is part of the reason this exists. It's not the only reason, but it is part. Why? Because the secrecy needed to maintain it requires such an apparatus. This is a very important secret. And the creation of the atomic bomb, the Manhattan Project, is one example of how, like, the genesis of this whole secret structure, and that's not UFO related. But immediately after the war, this phenomenon became a very big thing. And through the acquisition of exotic technology, forced the creation of a massive apparatus. I had a conversation with a scientist with a great deal of experience in the classified world. I will one day put his name out there. He said to me, the secrecy on this subject is so expensive. He said, now it's expensive in terms of research and development of the technology, but it's even vastly more expensive, 7 to 8 times the amount, he said, in terms of maintaining the security over the program. And I'm thinking, what does that involve? Not just guys with guns, but the creation of entire underground infrastructures, management of the media, all of that stuff costs money. Managing politicians, probably. All of it is expensive. The UFO phenomenon is partly responsible for our black budget national security culture. Again, not solely, but it is in part responsible for this $1 trillion a year business, which basically takes your tax dollars and feeds this gargantuan, economy-draining, soul-sucking, world-destroying reality. What else? How else can you describe it? That's it. It has been responsible for the creation of what I believe is my best hypothesis of a breakaway civilization. I think of it as the black budget world on steroids, that is with ET technology thrown in there. A classified world that is so advanced that their breakthroughs based on this subject, on this phenomenon, are classified and they are not permitted to reach you and me. So in the classified world, if they're studying ET tech, they come up with breakthroughs in propulsion, in energy. Those breakthroughs are way too important. You know, they may come up with money-making breakthroughs, and that's great. You get a nice ground floor investment opportunity, but some of these breakthroughs are too important. And in terms of free energy, propulsion technology, no, those do not make it to the rest of the world. Those are too transformative. But that doesn't mean that the classified world would then stop researching it. They simply race ahead of the rest of us to an extent where they're so far beyond us that they can genuinely be considered a separate civilization that has broken away from us. It doesn't necessarily mean that they all live on Mars, but maybe, or on the moon. I've always felt that the action's right here on Earth. This is where it is. But who knows how far they go? Do they have their own flying saucer technology? I think they probably do. I think there's a good, in fact, I have a little pamphlet in the other room called The Secret Space Program and Breakaway Civilization. It's 60, 70 pages, and it's my analysis of that whole thing and why I believe that is the case. Another aspect of the breakaway civilization that is in the works is not simply breaking away in terms of technology, but breaking away literally financially. And legally, we're seeing this out in the open. We're seeing the creation of a global system by which nations no longer matter, by which your vote no longer will matter. Things like the TPP and TTIP, the globalist partnerships that are being hammered through and shoved down your throat without most people even knowing, will in fact take away all of your ability to legislate labor laws, environmental laws, and all of that. It's all going to go away if they get their way. And they're creating a global system by which nations and individual votes do not matter. That's a breakaway. They're breaking away from us legally. The goals, the ultimate goals of I call our human handlers, I'm going to be real quick here, is to essentially, and you don't have to break into a Bilderberg meeting to find out what their plans are. You can go to the Aspen Institute, which is an open version of the Bilderberg meetings, essentially, in Aspen, Colorado, and you can read what they have to say. They're much more PC there, but it's the same agenda. Same people who go to the Bilderbergs go to the Aspen Institute. They talk about what they want to do. What do they want to do? They put it very nicely. They want to create a global system by which they are the lords and you're the serf, and your children and grandchildren will be their serfs forever and ever for the end of time. That's what they want, and they'll do it if we don't stop them. They want to enforce intellectual property rights, no free file sharing, no Pirate Bay. That's important because next generation Pirate Bay, I'm convinced, will have CAD drawings of 3D printable free energy devices. Someone's going to think of this and they're going to upload it, and you'll be able to download that design and you'll be able to make your own free energy device in your own living room and go off the grid. They're going to stop that. They don't want that to happen. That's one motivation for this global system, and many, many others, to prevent you from exercising your own freedom. They want to turn the web into TV. They want to surveil you, intimidate you for the rest of all time. They're doing that now. That's what 9/11's about. Beat you over the head with a national security stick, let you live in fear so that you don't protest. And if you do protest, your face will go into a database, and all of your information will be triangulated. You're in, and they'll know you, and it's a way to intimidate the population. That's the goal, and they're doing it. The good news for us is that change is inevitable. Think of it this way. Any system that is built on outrageous injustice and thievery and surveillance and is so unsustainable is not going to last forever. And that is this system right now. We're in it. It will not last forever. The only question is, when will it end and how will it end? We're in a very, very tumultuous time. Think about something like the price of oil. Simple. The foundation of our whole global system. And the price of oil goes way up, it goes way down, it goes way up. That's not conducive to a stable economic future. That's just one little example. Everything is in a state of flux. Our technology is in a state of flux. Our ideas are in a state of flux. Our culture, it's all changing rapidly. We have the WikiLeaks phenomenon by which people take digital data and just throw it out to the world. That will not stop, even if the US succeeds in killing Julian Assange, which apparently they tried to do recently by a burglar trying to break into the Ecuadorian embassy, who was then captured by armed security and then somehow escaped. Really? I was arrested a month ago in Poland. I was arrested in a Polish airport. It's a long story, but I tried to catch a flight and I broke past the passport control. Didn't realize I did, actually. I should not have done it. And I was literally being chased through the Frederick Chopin airport in Warsaw by 2 armed Polish police officers. Well, they eventually apprehended me. And I can tell you, I didn't escape from them. They had guns. They put me in a dark room for 20 minutes before they released me and said, get the hell out of here. And yet, true story, 1 month ago, and yet this guy who's breaking into the Ecuadorian embassy where Julian Assange was somehow gets away. So anyway, my point is simply, no matter how they try to take these guys out, there will always, we're in an era now where WikiLeaks and similar organizations will exist because they can and they will. So our world is built on an unstable edifice. And I do believe, if I have a faith in anything, I have a faith in the ultimate ability for truth to prevail. I just do. Maybe it's irrational, but I believe in it. And I think that we have a society where the lies are so profound, inevitably that it's going to rise to the surface and it will have an effect on the rest of us. I ask myself, and I don't really even know if this is a relevant question, but will we ever be able to deal with these other beings who appear to be among us? Just worth asking. I really need to get to the end, and I'm at the end now, actually. Do they want to deal with us? Well, I think, they're watching us. I think that they are probably dealing with us very effectively, but we're a bit unpredictable, perhaps. How do we win? This is what I say. And by win, I simply mean we've got a couple of things happening. We have this massive discrepancy of this global phenomenon that is not getting recognized and is being held tightly by what I feel, okay, this is my editorializing, by an unjust and rapacious, and let us even go so far as to say evil elite of human beings who are managing this process. So I consider that a problem from my point of view. How do we overcome that? Well, I cannot see, this has completely gone dark. Can anyone help me out here? Does anyone understand how to get some light out of this projector? Because I can't even see. The projector's about to die. Does anyone know how to fix this? It's like I can't even read my own writing here. It's bright on the screen. Well, okay. My feeling is, and what I mean by here is it's a lot of the folks who have been talking here this week and have been saying the same thing. We win by creating a cultural change. I really think this is the most effective way to do it. I was a participant a few years ago of the citizens' hearing on disclosure that was in Washington, D.C. And that was kind of a disclosure hearing. I'm glad I was part of it. It was important. But I actually think that the most important legacy of that and many other things is that it's on YouTube now for new generations of people to watch. And what is doing that and many other things are changing our culture. We're seeing a massive cultural change that's taken place. We still have a long way to go with this subject. But think about something as, and this is, some people agree and some people don't, but something like gay marriage, which whatever you think about it, 1 generation ago was considered, oh my God, no way, not ever. And now like 80% of the public, I think, something like that, supports it. It's been a sea change, a cultural sea change in the space of 1 generation. All right, and I think that with the UFO subject, what we're seeing is potentially something similar, that a rapid sea change can take place and is taking place. We're not done yet, but the solution, and the folks from the Saucer group of New England and many of the others, the key is, have said, and I agree, is personal bravery by you. Don't be afraid to talk about this. Recognize that there's a hunger for truth about this, and and people want to hear. If you've got something to say on it, say it. Don't be afraid. The worst thing you can do is be afraid. Step into it and be, as Gandhi said, be the change you want to see. The new order of reality is a fight to end secrecy. It's the fight between openness and secrecy. That's like the new arms race, basically, in our world. This is the war that's happening. That's, I think, Occupy, and a nice little pepper spraying of people who are just peacefully protesting. That's, in a sense, part of the face of our world today. Our job is to speak out to the truth, to lean into your own truth, and don't be afraid to speak it to others. And I do believe that we will make a transformation. The last thing I'm going to say, and I'm wrapping up, I almost visualize the struggle now in our world is between an old hierarchical up and down structure of power where very few people control the resources and control the people as a result. Between that and something new, a new paradigm that's horizontal, not vertical. In other words, if we were able to get better access to energy, knowledge, breaking down the structures of lies that have enveloped the subject, we have the opportunity to create some changes, not vertical but horizontal, and actually having a true liberation of our society. I ran a little bit over. I want to thank you so much. That's my website. I'll be glad to talk with you later. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much. I am very grateful. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Mike Stevens with Seacoast Saucers of New England. I was a tour guide for this year's UFO Safari Trolley Tours.
So have you been on to these sites plenty of times? Because I know you do certain activities with Seacoast Saucers. Do you guys do stuff like that?
Very rarely that we do historical type cases like this. I have actually been out to the Muscarello sighting with another local researcher because we had great weather conditions this winter that allowed us access to it. But normally we work more with individuals who had had experience, not so much the actual reporting of sightings.
So what kind of goes into being like a modern UFO place that doesn't work with that history? Because I actually mostly come from people knowing the history side. What's it like to be like a living UFO investigation unit?
For me, that's what the whole thing is about. This is what all of this should be about. It's not about what's in the sky. It's not about where they come from. It's not about how they get here. Because no matter what the answer to any of those questions is, the problem still remains. It affects people. So no matter what the cause is, the problem's still the same. It affects people, and that's the part that I think we need to work on.
So how does it affect people?
They're left with traumatic experiences. They don't have anywhere they can talk to find help. A lot of it due to the social conditioning and the social stigma surrounding the subject, and that's why we try to be a voice for them when they can't be, and hopefully give them the courage to find their voice.
Oh, sorry. I was curious if you worked with any like counseling professionals and stuff like that too. I was like curious of what kind of work lines a lot of the Seacoast Saucers people come from.
Most of us, Chuck has a background with social services, and he's actually was a licensed private investigator in Maine and New Hampshire for a combination of like 12 years. I do carpeting. There's no big, and Val works with aquaculture.
How do people kind of find themselves coming to you guys? How do you guys create a support network for people?
Well, the first two things we usually hear is, this is going to sound crazy, but, and the second is, I'm not sure if I should be here or not. And then, you know, we usually say, well, if you're asking yourself that, you probably should be. And then a lot of these people who have been before will usually, because they remember what it's like coming into the room for the first time, or will kind of take the reins and just kind of recant a little bit of their experience or what brought them there, you know. And then nobody's forced to ever share, but it kind of creates the atmosphere where it's open and people, once they're comfortable, will begin to share. And then it's usually, we do most of it in a group setting just to, you know, we think having that network and community helps But some people aren't comfortable with that, so then we will do private sessions if that works better for some. And for the most part, it's just letting them know that yes, this is happening, you're not nuts, and it's happened to other people.